Hey there guys, this is Obsidian Chill. Got another video for you today. And I thought I'd do something a little bit different. I haven't done one of these tier maker videos in a while. I've done previous ones where I talked about DPS metas, I ranked raids. I do intend to do the hardest bosses, but that got really complicated with the new content. So I'm thinking about doing something where I rank the hardest bosses in terms of different, because there's so many raids, so many, well, not even raids, but so many bosses in this game. It's really hard to choose. So I'm thinking I may do something where it's like, hardest bosses GU36, hardest bosses AM days, and hardest bosses stats revamp. I might do something like that. You can let me know in the comment section if that's still something you're interested in seeing in terms of me talk about what I feel is the hardest bosses from each kind of, I'd say, generation of DC Online. But in this one, we're taking a look at the artifacts. Now, there is going to be some inherent bias in this because some of the artifacts in here are only good for artifact swapping, but they are still a really good artifact. They're just meant for a swap. So I can't really fail the artifact because it's not going to be basically on your loadout the entire time. So I know that kind of like loops back to the whole drama around artifact swapping, but the artifact itself is still going to stand on its merits alone. So let's kind of jump into this here. Obviously, Eye of the Gemini, S tier. I mean, that goes without, you don't even have to explain that. Eye of the Gemini, not even from the DPS aspect, but how powerful it is for like each and every role. Like you have certain artifacts where it's like, say, like Manacles. I can do this well. So Manacles of Force is definitely going to be S tier, but it's only good as a tank. I mean, technically you can use it as a DPS and a healer, but it's just not as practical, especially now that we have Lazarus Pit. But so that's where Eye of the Gemini, where it excels in not only the DPS role, but the healer role, the tank role, even the controller role. It's still useful because you can give the 5% prec and might buff. So it's not as powerful of a role, but it's definitely OP for the other roles. So that's why you spend either the investment or the funds to level up an artifact. It's so useful for not only your primary role but your secondary role as well. Not necessarily if they go in order. Amulet of Row is definitely going to be S tier as well. I mean, that's the complete staple of the control role, having the extra debuffs. It's a huge difference in damage. I know players don't necessarily see that, or it's like you can't really tell the damage you're doing because you think, well, it's either 10% debuff or 15% defense debuff. You wouldn't think that it necessarily makes a huge difference with that 5%, but it really does. I just wish that there's more mechanics in this game that tied into the healing debuff and the attack debuff. Like, just imagine you're doing like Elite Plus in the source wall, and if your controller had the attack debuff active, it could literally make the difference between one of the sub bosses one-shotting you or not. But that's a story for another day. But I wish at least the attack and the healing debuff mattered more. S tier is definitely going to be the strategist card. Strategist card is probably the most powerful DPS artifact. The Gemini still relies on supercharges, where strategist card applies to every kind of situation, and it's especially now because it's scaling, because strategist card came out so long ago. And nowadays, when we have the buff might, you see strategy card ticks with well over 100k damage, which is just huge, and that's all ticking in the background. So it's one of those cards where you aren't fully aware of the damage that's doing, but if you saw like a combat log analyzer breakdown, you would see that, like, for example, if you took a look at like Nature Gorilla might DPS, which was, you thought Nature Gorilla was so powerful, the dots, the heat vision, the finisher hitting AoE damage in Gorilla form, but if you actually saw the breakdown of the combat log analyzer, the strategist card procs from all those dots and everything else, massively more damage than everything else. The strategist card damage on Nature Might dwarfed everything else in terms of damage. So we can touch on some fail ones. And same thing, this is going to be my opinion as well. But definitely, in terms of fail, we're going to definitely put a Megahedron. A Megahedron, just from the very inception of the artifact. Even now, when you're watching the video, they buffed it. It's still, to get the 5 or 6% might or whatever it actually ends up giving you, still, I mean, you might as well get the 5% might buff from running like Eye of the Gemini. It's a use. You can't swap it. You have to have it on as a permanent artifact, and it's never been viable enough. In terms of another fail one, now the sparring AI it worked well in the past at some point. The problem is it relies around extending the immunity, but the immunity itself in this game is so weird with all the breakout profiles. Like, it doesn't actually give you, like, really, it was like an original battle tank artifact because it does give you the extra weapon damage. But other than that, like, the immunity duration never worked properly, and that's somewhat of the artifact's fault and somewhat of the actual game's fault. Just how breakout profiles are treated nowadays. Another S tier artifact. Actually, let's do the Circe's Mask. It's one of those things where it's really neat in the description, but I just couldn't find a build viable enough for it. Like, it works well as ice, but at the same time, ice you would much rather run like refractor because your health is going to be low as ice because you're speccing into restoration and dominance, and still you have the pull, so you have extra dominance. It gets more extra base health. So basically, you can kind of cheat your way at not having enough health pool with refractor, or you're running Gemini because it's hard to give up Manacles and Mystic. They kind of go towards together. So Mystic will kind of put A because it's not OP enough to be S tier, but Manacles and Mystic is a great combination for tank artifacts. So if you run Supercharged, what most tanks do, they take Gemini and take those three. So it doesn't really leave room for Circe's Mask. I have used it as ice. Technically, if the problem is it would work well with fire because then at least you get the increased self-healing when it breaks, but at the same time, fire immolation lasts forever. You have hard light shield. It's just there's not enough fire shields to even worry about proccing it. So that's why it's not to fail because it does do its job well. It's just that it's not practical for any actual builds. In terms of Philosopher's Stone, we're going to put that in a B range. I mean, Philosopher's Stone is only a swap artifact. And really all it does is technically it does extend the duration of your supply drop. You also have the increased buff for the double seconds. Power cost is minimal during that time, which doesn't really play a factor anyway. But at the same time, is really only paired well when you use Neovenom. So if you pop your supply drop with Neovenom boost supercharge, your Neovenom will last with a double supply drop buff the entire duration. So it works out well there, but Neovenom itself is a 45-second cooldown supercharge. It's just always not as useful. But Philosopher's Stone is a great swap art, but you would never, even a million years, use it as a permanent artifact. Claw is definitely going to be S tier. Claw of Alcon. That's in terms of not only providing the support buff and the DPS buff, changes the way controlling was done in general because you couldn't really have a buff troll until Claw came around in terms of all the percentage buffs. It's huge, and it's swappable technically as well because the buff lasts for 12 seconds whether or not it's equipped or not, which is a story for another day. But your Claw, you don't want to go into content nowadays with a Claw because if you do, the power pool, like the power return may be high, but you're missing massive amount of buffs for the support roles and the DPS as well. So let's see, Soul Amplifier, I'm going to put A tier just because even though it's S tier for might, but it's not S tier for prec. If you're prec DPS, you would never use Soul Amplifier, so I can't really put that in S tier. But pretty much the way this game is designed with might DPS having like poor single target options, like there's really only like 3 or 4 power sets in the game out of 15 that don't need like heat vision. Everything else needs heat vision. So like you've got like Celestial that can get away with it. You've got Light that can get away with it. You got Gadgets that can get away with it. Stuff like that where everything else requires heat vision. So it has to be in that A tier rank. Rings of Azar, I'm going to put it in the C because really it's a useless artifact. It was a part of the health buff meta. So controllers may argue about that, but it really Rings is just like the 4th or 5th option down. So if you're if you refer back to my artifact swapping kind of drama video, really the controllers would have like Claw, Amulet, and Tetra and Cog. So that's already 4 artifacts you're swapping. And then at that point, you could be swapping in like Parasite, you could be swapping in Clarion, Scrap the Soul Cloak for supercharges, either Gemini. The Rings of Azar are pretty down low on that list, especially because you're running like Bop Comp Link as well for to make sure you don't have CC. So really, it's really far down that list. That's like the 6th or 7th artifact you swap just for some extra health buff. So it's helpful at the same time, but really in the long run, you could definitely do without that. Gem of Horus, I'm going to throw in the F tier. Even though it was recently buffed, it's one of those artifacts. I don't necessarily blame the artifact, but it is a fail in terms of how DC's system is right now in terms of the weapon pass. We only have 2 viable weapon combos for endgame damage, which is going to be Brawling Shuriken Storm and Dual Flurry Shot. You can get away with Staff and technically like Rifle Flamethrower for melee, but really those are more, I wouldn't say like gimmicky, but niche builds. That's not going to be the actual meta. So until we have an actual weapon pass, it's just too difficult to work with Gem of Horus. It was OP when it released just because of splitting damage, but after that, even the attempts by Ramar after the fact to make it more useful, it's just not enough for Prec DPS. It's not strong enough to get away from the actual Prec meta. So that ties into Transformation card being in S tier. Transformation Strategist card, and then Eye of the Gemini is pretty much the go-to combo for like 99% of builds. It's just those 2 cards combination. So everything you crit ties in Strategist card, and then it's just those 2 have the most synergy out of any kind of artifact that we've ever seen in this game, and they came out at the same time. Let's throw in some healer ones. Definitely Starheart, I'm going to say, is a fail again. I mean, I know some healers swap it just for the health buff, but I mean, even the health buff is not that strong. There's way, way better options for healing. Even like Demon Fang, if you want to do like a true battle healer build, is now viable now. Or not, I wouldn't say necessarily viable, but it is. There's some potential to it. But Starheart is just, at least as our rings, you can swap it as a troll just because you have that ability. But swapping as a healer, it's just going to lead to issues. And there's much better artifacts out there for healer anyway. Page of Destiny, I'm going to put. That's a tough one. Is it going to be A tier or is it going to be S tier? I would put this A tier and then Purple Healing Ray S tier, because Purple Healing Ray essentially makes you as a battery just as a healer. Like there's no healer that's going to, like say the troll dies. Usually that was an issue with the healer in the past, or the healer always struggled for power, but with Purple Healing Ray, it eliminates all of that. No, not only does it give you the 20% power return, but it also gives you either the extended group heal or the shield for when it's soul ability. And it's super easy to proc Purple Healing Ray. Like if they, I mean, there's you can pretty much proc it on cooldown. Purple Healing Ray was one of the main reasons why Fracture Godsphere Elite was passed at the end with Zeus. It's just the massive healing potential from Purple Healing Ray. And that's the thing. You don't even have to be in the range. So you can sit at the very back of the room, not even hitting the boss, and just being your own basically battery healer with Purple Healing Ray. It's just a massive advantage to have this artifact. Page, the reason why I don't put Page in S tier is that Page of Destiny is really strong for like a lead or content where you can get one shot, because it's basically that rescue heal. So say if there's a moment where like a healer has to block, or any kind of content where you could be brought down to like 5% health, the healer has to block or could be busy and doesn't have enough time or reaction speed to heal you back up to full. With Page of Destiny stacks, the healer doesn't have to worry about that. It's just automatic. So it's a huge rescue heal. But in like event content, regular content, alerts, duos, like everyday content, it's not even needed. So that's why I put this in A tier, because it still is super powerful. I mean, there's nothing like that. It's like Electricity's Biocap, which was OP for years, and even better for everyone else. I'm going to put Quizlet in the A tier. That recently took over Grim because they fixed Quizlet. So the reason why people may not have heard of Quizlet is that before, the damage wasn't corrected, where it was every 5 seconds, it was every 7 seconds where it did Mega Blast, which made Grim still stronger in the long run. Which didn't match the description. It was either, was it 5 or 8? I can't remember. Something with the description didn't match actually Quizlet's damage. When that was corrected by Sharon, then Quizlet became that A tier. So you have an artifact that not only has more damage than Grim and even Robot Psychic, you have something where every time you proc a supercharge, it's going to do AoE damage up to 8 targets and do basically splitting damage on each target. When you use a 10,000 supercharge, it's a massive single target beam. And these are procced automatically. Summons automatically as well, so you don't have to worry about if it dies, it'll resummon. And then as well, you gain 1% supercharge every time you use Mega Blast. So every time you're hitting a power every 5 seconds, you get that 1% supercharge. So it's really an all-in-one artifact, especially great for powers with like really good 100% supercharges like munitions, like Quantum, because you're earning supercharge less. In terms of Dead King Scepter, same thing. I'm going to put this in a B. Just because, Dead King Scepter, once again, just like Philosopher's Stone, it's a really, really powerful artifact, but it's 100% a swap artifact. So it's great for my TPS because the orbital assistance procs when you use when you use an orbital strike that lasts for 30 seconds, those scale primarily off your might only stat only. So that's why I wouldn't put it in A or S tier, because if a Prec DPS is using it, they're going to get much lower ticks because they're not spec'd full might. So that's why it's really OP for like a large might DPS. I've seen like 180k, 200k ticks off this. It's huge, which in turn is into the might buff. But it's not good enough to be A or S tier, just because you would never level it unless you're going to swap it, because it's not good enough to be left in the time. Plus the cooldown reduction on like your henchman, trinket, and everything else. So it's very handy for like pet builds, for everything else. Lamort card, I'm going to say is a C. Is it going to be a fail though? That's a tough one. I'm going to put it fail. I tried to make Lamort card work. The issue with Lamort card is the finisher. Finisher cooldowns are already like 2 seconds or so. So having a cooldown reduction on your finisher doesn't even work with the rotation, because you still have to wait for your rotation to complete. It's not like you're waiting for a finisher to come off cooldown. Always in the rotation, it's always going to be off cooldown regardless. And the other issue with Lamort is it's not a guaranteed crit. So I've had plenty of times where, like when I was testing in Clock Tower, or even Survival Mode, I used this in Survival Mode Season 2 and tried to use it as well. You can miss the crit on it, and then that's massive damage. So you had this artifact the whole time that you waited until it got down to 35%, and it didn't even crit. Or the issue is that if you die, this was really common in Clock Tower, so I was using it in Clock Tower as nature, and then basically the group would wipe when the bots came out on Final Boss. So then that was before 35%. So I died before even the proc happened. So the Lamort's damage is not good enough to overcome the dropping of Strategist card. Technically, yeah, you can swap in Lamort every time you use a finisher and swap it out. I know some people talked about that, and then technically it can work for Rage, because Rage has Eviscerating Chain, which other powers don't have access to in terms of like a 6-second cooldown like that. But it's not enough to be viable. Lamort card is like the first artifact that I consumed into another artifact, because I know I would never use it again. Lazarus Pit Water is going to be moved into S tier now. So this is going to be something that you've seen from Survival Mode and seen other people talk about. Hopefully you haven't seen like groups shouting for specifically Lazarus Pit Water, but with the recent buff with the that Romaro made to Lazarus Pit Water, makes it incredibly OP. It's game changing, really. And I wouldn't doubt that any kind of future no death feat in Elite is going to be completed only with the usage of all 8 players having Lazarus Pit. It's just disgustingly overpowered in terms of this game's meta. I'm sure it works with Dark Knights really well in Final Fantasy, but in DC is a completely different game from Final Fantasy. Let's do another healer one. Orb of Orion, I'm going to put C as well. There was a time where Orb was great, but same thing, since Page and Purple Healing Ray came out, it's just not as viable. There's certain situations where you can use it, but at the same time, if you have Transformation card, say like you're using Transformation card, Page, and Purple Healing Ray, which is like the pure healer combo, you're already going to get almost strong enough heal just from when it crits from Transformation card. And then you don't have to worry about spamming it with the excess power cost, which puts a strain on your controller, because the controller is most likely using the claw buff, so you don't have instant power. So it's one of those rare situations where there's situations where it'll be useful, but in everyday uses, you're not going to worry about Orb. Parasite, we can put a B artifact. It's only a swap artifact now unless you're using pure power build, but which aren't necessary. The problem was with Parasite, I almost should put it as a C. Nah, because it does have synergy with Bob. That's tough. Because really all it does is let's put it C. There was a time where Parasite was great because, so many artifacts came out. We have like 41 artifacts in this video to kind of go through. But in my opinion, Parasite Power Harness is going to be a C now when we're taking into effect that all the artifacts are available to us, because all it does is increases your power pool, which is great for my DPS because your power pool is what is based off your power regen with superpowered. So the greater power pool, the greater regen you have with the superpowered build. But at the same time, controllers aren't swapping this for might DPS, they're swapping it for Prec DPS so they can get the extra, like 1,000 or 2,000 Prec or something like that, whatever it gives nowadays. And then it has synergy with Bop Comlink because you'd have Bop Comlink used. Actually, we'll put Bop Comlink on with C as well. Those have synergy together where all your debuffs will come out as one. So basically that. And then at the same time, you'd want your debuff efficiency white mod in your generator to basically proc off Parasite as well. So it's just, it worked great during the Power Troll meta, but after that, we've completely moved on to the Buff Troll meta or like the Art Swap meta. But power trolling is just not required whatsoever with builds nowadays. Might DPS don't use enough power. You got Prec DPS not using any power at all. And you got Purple Healing Ray healers, or like even the Gemini returns power back. It's just there's too many power sources that you don't require power trolling anymore. Bop Comlink, I put a C as well. The same thing. I mean, it kind of works in like niche builds. If you're going to be artifact swapping, you'd have Bop Comlink, you'd have Amulet of Rao on your loadout the entire time, and then swap Claw. You'd swap Claw with, Tetra, Cog, Rings of Azar, Parasite, and basically that's how you're playing as a controller now, which is even something I don't do. So it's not something viable to be used either as a power troll build or a buff troll build or a battle troll build. It's basically only works as that art swap and in elite content because of once again, the breakup profiles being weird. Like I mentioned with Sparring AI, Bop Comic works because it doesn't apply any CC effect. So the reason why you make, especially TDSE with like the snipers and stuff, and basically people yelling the troll not to stun the ads because the tank has to keep them immune or juggled. Bop Comic kind of rescues it there, but it's not strong enough to be making like S tier, A or B. I probably could have done more rankings, but at the same time, this kind of gives a good overview. In terms of Scrap the Soul Cloak, that's going to be A. Now, you do have the chest mod, the extended supercharge mod giving 5%, but the Scrap Soul Cloak gives 7, as well as a cooldown reduction on supercharge. So it kind of ties into that Eye of the Gemini meta, but you just scrap the Soul Cloak with the amount of supercharge regen you can get, even from like healer spam and everything else. Just nowadays, supercharges are the meta. That could change with the supercharge revamp eventually if it comes. But right now, scrap the Soul Cloak, especially if you're a DPS or like a healer, it's an artifact you can't do without. And once again, kind of like Eye of the Gemini, it works for all roles. Like scrap the Soul Cloak works if you're a DPS, works if you're a controller, works if you're a tank, it works if you're a healer. All builds with all roles can use Scrap the Soul Cloak. So that's why it's a great artifact to level, because you don't have to worry about it being useless for your role because there's always a build that works with it. Computer HUD, I'm going to put as a C. It's not a fail. It's just that right now hybrid DPS is just not as proficient of a meta as Might or Prec. There are situations where Computer HUD can work. It works really well. It's just takes a little bit to get going in terms of filling like your Might bar, your Prec bar, and your Supercharge bar. But if you have everything going all at once and can fill those bars and use it in your rotations, it can work really well and it's really strong. I've made it work with Atomic. I've seen it work with like Gadget's Prec. Just with how like stealth works, and you can put the ability on stealth. So it's not a fail art, but it's not strong enough to be like S tier, A or B, just because of how hybrid DPSing works. Clarion, we're going to put in S tier. So Clarion, same thing. It can be used technically by all roles. I mean, obviously it's designed as like a battle healer art, but controllers can use it for the shield. Even tanks can use it for the shield. DPS, great for healers. There's literally no drawback to Clarion. You get the AoE damage from it. You get the extra healing. It makes Clarion has completely changed how alerts healing works, because you technically don't even need a healer. If you've got like a tank or a controller using Clarion, you can always have like that damage reduction shield up. You can have the extra healing from it for the damage you do. So it's completely changed the game in terms of how form and content is healed. Just because that Clarion shield only applies to 4 players. So in a raid, it gets a little bit tricky in terms of RNG, in terms of how or where, what players it'll apply to, but in alerts, it's always going to be applied to the 4. Just a refractor, we're going to put as a B. It's not commonly, it's basically, as an artifact, if you level it as a tank and kept it, then it's still usable. Like I still use it in some of my builds, but I switch it out routinely for like Everyman or Eye of the Gemini. The problem is a lot of tanks nowadays use supercharges. Myself, as a personal preference, I don't, say for like Ice and Rage, I don't use a supercharge. But that's why I can run just a refractor. Especially as Rage is nice for the health buff. Technically, even as Fire, it's nice for the health buff. But Everyman prototype is way stronger for Fire in terms of the like Mystic Manacles and Everyman prototype. So that's why it's not strong to be A or S tier, but it's not like a C or a fail because it does its job really well. It's just that players' preference nowadays is to run that supercharge for tanking. So let's see, Amulet of, let's see, Amulet, Lanier's Amulet. That's tricky. I'm going to put it as, I'll put it just as an A because it does its job really well in terms of buffing might. I mean, there's that drawback to it. I personally don't like using it just because it's not great for every single kind of situation. I don't show my videos because I don't want everyone using it because it's going to stress the healers, and players nowadays aren't going to know when not to use it in terms of like taking dots or the issue is that, you know, if you're a DPS constantly proccing Lanier's Amulet at rank 10 in terms of like using a 2 or 300 power cost, you're going to be stealing priority heals away from the tank and then just be causing issues. So players just don't completely understand the side effects of using a Lanier's Amulet. They just see the damage and kind of say, well, whatever, the healers are going to heal me. But there's situations where you can and can't use it. But I can't argue with the results. I mean, that's a huge might buff. Pied Piper's Flute, we're going to put as a B. It does its job well. There's still an RNG component to it, and it doesn't work with every supercharge. So the most common supercharges, like Neo Venom Boost and Circuit Breaker, has no impact to it because the supercharge actually has to do damage. And then other great supercharges, say like Munitions Big Gun, you're completely reliant on the RNG because it could be like that extra 40% damage, could be the 10% damage, or what is it, 20 is the minimum. Either way, it's still, there's too strong an RNG component to it, and it's always a small part. Like I said, it's not good enough to be used completely. But it can be great and it can enhance your powers. That's why I'll put it not like a C or a fail, because if you do have it, there's situations where you can swap it in. Grimbor's Chains, I'm going to put it as a C. It's not, the Grimbor's Chains can work. I know controllers that make it work. It's not a fail art because it still does its job. It's just I don't find it very practical. That's why I'll put it as a C. But it's a good enough art that it's not a fail. Technically, you can make it work, especially with like battle trolling, or if you want to run like a battle troller and like a power troll. So it's just, I personally don't use it. I personally don't like it. I know others can make it work, and I've seen it make it work. It's just not as viable, but it's not good enough to. It's not. Doesn't suck enough to be a fail. So we're getting down to the buff artifacts. Those ones I'm going to put. I'm going to put B as well. Because, yes, it's a huge buff, but the thing is, since it's a group buff, if you don't have it, it's the same effect as of having it. So if a controller wants to swap these artifacts in, then great. If they don't, I mean, it's whatever. As a DPS, you wouldn't run COG or wouldn't run Tetra. It's just not viable. What would have made it S tier, and which is what I wanted the effect to have, I know this is kind of a side jaunt from this, but I wanted Tetra and Cog to buff more might and prec for the user. So if you did it, it buffed your might higher than it would the group. And then I would have used it. Because the reason why I didn't use it is because, you know, with my max spec, I always spec health in terms of running elite. I never spec, I spec like 10 prec just to get the percentage, but I put everything in the health. So if I'm going to buff the group, I mean, yes, that's a group thing, but I don't want to be giving all this prec DPS, like, you know, tens of thousands of extra might for them to smoke me as a might DPS just because they're going to be buffing themselves as prec, and then I'm going to be buffing them as might. So I know it's like the whole group aspect of it, but as a DPS, I'm inherently selfish as a DPS, and most DPS are. That's why they say it's a control artifact, because controllers, it was changed to make the controller work as well. But if Tetra buffed my might more than it buffed the group, then I would run it. I would choose to run it. But I want more of a buff. But same thing. It does its job well. It's not to be a C or a fail. That's why it's kind of neutral. I would say B is like neutral. Let's see, Bottled City Soda. I'm going to put that in S tier. It's S tier because in terms of XP, it's super cheap. It does take the same catalyst that a 200 artifact would take, so that's a little bit expensive from that way. But I still believe everyone should have Bottled City Soda leveled. It has different effects for each role. It's 90% power turn and health guaranteed, and it's unlimited. So it's just it's one of those things where it's very cheap to level from the XP wise. So I think it's an artifact that everyone should have. Let's see, we're getting to kind of nitty gritty. I'm going to put Grim as C. So right now, power interactions aren't strong enough to warrant it. So I've already done a video on this, but even though Grim provides constant damage, even though Grim provides the power interaction to give you that extra 10% if you're using that in your rotation, Quinzet still beats it on every single front. So there's some abilities like, say, Quantum with lift, munitions with burning, and chain gun, where you have to have a power interaction active. But at the same time, there's other abilities you can do that, like heat vision, flat cannon, stuff like that, or singularity, stuff like that. So that's why Grim, it's not enough to be a fail, because it still technically reduces your power regen. It still has 5% might, 5% prec. So it's still an okay artifact. Like if you already have it, then you don't have to consume it. But in every facet of Grim, Quinzet beats it. So that's why I can't even put it as a B. Lasso for me is going to be a C artifact. Or should I put it as a fail? Nah, it's not. If Batuba was watching this video, he'd be upset at me if I put it as a fail. So, because I know that's his favorite artifact. So I'll put it as a C, just because Lasso, when it came out, it was broken because DPS was using it. And then basically all the dots were like didn't split, so you'd have like massive dot ticking on every single ad that used Lasso on. And then since then, Lasso's only used really to like cheese stuff. So like DPS or controllers use it to yank ads away. You're cheesing it, like say Source Wall with those ads, yanking it. So it's just that every kind of situation, like the effigies, even Survival Mode Season 2, you use Lasso to bug out the statues on Zeus. So really, Lasso hasn't had any good things that's happened to it, and it's really annoying for the tanks too, because you'll see a tank using it, completely drag the ads away as a DPS. You're going to be missing damage. It doesn't actually stun the ads, so then really you still are taking damage from it. So it's one of those things where it's an artifact that just doesn't. It's only used basically as a gimmick or to cheese things, and even then you only need it like rank 80 just to use the Lasso effect. So that's why most people in like Source Wall just have it at rank 80. Everyman Prototype is going to be an A. It's not going to be S tier because it doesn't work with every tank that well. It's really OP for fire. Like if you have a bunch of ads and you're a fire tank with like Manacles, Mystic, and Everyman Prototype, you are basically not dying. Like when all the ads came out during like QE, a fire tank could just sit there like a rage and just eat it because of Everyman Prototype, because of how the health pools are. Mercy's tough to mention. I'm going to put that as a B. I'm going to put that neutral, just because there needs to be some full testing with it. It does this job well, but it's really the same thing. It's like a pet artifact. It's not strong enough to trump any other meta. But say if you were pet DPS using like Source Shard, which I'll rank next, like Source Shard, Mercy, it does have some advantages there. Same thing. Venomous Dispenser is going to be B as well, because once again, Venomous Dispenser, it's going to be a purely swap artifact. It was recently just buffed, so that's why it was nerfed, because it was completely overpowered during the original Prec meta. It's one of those things where it's got an 18-second buff for 12 seconds, but the weapon buff itself lasts for 20 seconds. So it's basically just a swap artifact to give yourself a little bit more prec, which is why I was annoyed, because Cog and Tetra are group prec buffs, and Venomous Dispenser is a personal might buff, and there's no drawback. So the only personal might buff we have is Linear's Amulet, which takes massive damage hits on you depending on what power cost you use, where the Precision DPS get a personal buff for prec that has 0 drawbacks. So that's why I was like kind of miffed when they came out with the aim basically asking for a personal might buff. Source Shard, we're going to put that in B, just because it's required. Actually, it's an A. It should be an A, because basically you can't pet DPS without Source Shard. Even I wonder if it should be S tier then. It should be S tier, because basically not everyone's going to pet DPS. Pet DPSing itself is kind of like a niche. The only reason why we can pet DPS in DC is because of an artifact meta. If you didn't have Source Shard and the Godwave proc, pet DPSing wouldn't even exist. Even if you try to pet DPS with like sorcery, or like with a crystal or brick, it's not going to work. It wasn't viable. But then when Godwave came out, it did buff it considerably. And it is very strong. It's just kind of that niche DPSing. And the last one being Demon Fang. We're going to put that as C, just because you would never use Demon Fang unless you were trying to be a battle healer, which is still a role that I don't necessarily agree with. And it still is it's the same thing with like concept as like pet DPSing. It's kind of that niche build. So if you were like battle healing, yeah, you'd run like Clarion, Demon Fang, and probably like Purple Healing Ray or Gemini, something like that. But it's not strong enough to be any higher than C, just because there's not even really situations where require battle healing. Battle healing is just that extra thing you can do, or do it in like alerts. Demon Fang gives you the option, like it gives the, if you're players you want a battle healer, then yes, it's certainly more viable than it was in the past. It's just not a required role, but if it is something that you were interested in, of course, you could run Demon Fang and make it work. So this is my artifact tier ranking, and we'll see if you guys leave your comment in the description if you guys agree with this or would have different rankings placed on it. Also, I will link the template if you want to make your own template and just kind of, you can either join my Discord and share it there with me to see how you would rank it, or you can link it in the description, whichever you want to do. And want to share this. So this is just another fun video that I thought I'd do. And let me know if you want how you want that boss tier system done. If you want it split up with like GO36 AM days and stats revamp days, because if I did it all together, I don't think it would make sense, because I'd be comparing too much from like how bosses used to work, how they work now. Because say for like, because nowadays if you're doing like Save the Universe content, the bosses don't act like the same as they did back then. So then you're thinking, well, it's easy now. I've done this. I've done an elite. It's no problem. Well, even back then it was much harder. So, take care, guys. We'll see you in the next video.